Let's consider the canon of the Old Testament. How do we know which books belong into the Old Testament? First of all, we look at the New Testament, and there are many interesting ideas about how the New Testament gives witness to the canon of the Old Testament. First, notice all the different terms that the New Testament uses to describe the Old Testament. Scripture in the singular, scriptures in the plural, sacred writings, the law, that would be more than just the Pentateuch, and then the law and the prophets. And so we have lots of phrases in the New Testament that speaks that they understood that there was a recognized body of literature that was inspired of God. We find also that Jesus himself understood the canon of the Old Testament, often quoted from it. He probably understood the threefold division of the Old Testament as the law, the prophets, and the writings. We see that in Luke 24 and Luke 11. We know that 31 of the 39 books of the Old Testament from each of the three sections are in fact quoted in the New Testament. So again, a fullness of representation of the Old Testament scriptures by our New Testament writers. We find that even our Jewish friends understood the canon of the Old Testament. Philo, a first century Jew, suggested that Jews would rather die 1,000 times than ever decide to alter the scriptures. So we knew that they had a very high view of Scripture. Josephus is going to claim that 22 books were canonical, whereas the Masoretic text, the Hebrew version of the Old Testament, had 24. And that's not a problem because Josephus's 22 equals the Masoretic text 24, which equals our 39 books of the Old Testament. And basically he made a distinction because he combined Ruth with Judges, Lamentations with Jeremiah. The Hebrew Bible, as we said, has 24 books, and that's because Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles are considered as one, and the 12 minor prophets are considered as one. And so when you add up their 24 and then 11 or 12 of the minor prophets, and then they also combined Ezra and Nehemiah, plus the three subcategory of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, we see that in fact Josephus's 22 equals the Hebrew Old Testament's 24, which equals our 39. We find that in AD 90, the Synod of Jamnia also ratified the 39 books that we know of as the Old Testament as canonical literature. And that, of course, is important because they would distinguish from the Apocrypha, which is found in the Septuagint. We know that the Old Testament was divided into three categories called the Tanakh, which was an acronym for the Old Testament, the T for Torah, which was the law, the first 5 books, the N for the Nevi'im, or the prophets, and notice how they divided up their prophets, the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, then the latter prophets, the major ones, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and the minor, they viewed 12 as one. And then the writings, or the Ketuvim, they had 11. They had the poetical books, Psalms, Proverbs, Job. They had their 5 scrolls, and then they had their historical. Notice then that they would begin with Genesis and end with Chronicles. And again, all this is important to understand that our Jewish friends and the New Testament writers understood what we consider the Old Testament, the 39 books of the Old Testament, to be inspired by God and hence the canon of Scripture.